Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Life is uncertain. It's okay to feel stressed, anxious, worried, or frustrated. It's normal. With CalHope's free and secure mental health resources, it's easy to get the help you and your loved ones need when you need it the most. Call our warm line at 833-317-4673 or live chat at calhope.org today.
Dr. Travis Brown, what is This Medical Life all about?
This is the pursuit of knowledge as we learn about diseases from the ancient times to the present day. These are the stories of medicine.
Dr. Travis Brown, welcome to the first of a new podcast, a sister podcast, if you like, to This Pathological Life, This Medical Life. Welcome up into the Talked About Marketing studio.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And it's nice, isn't it? This is the foothills of the Adelaide Hills for people around the world wondering where we are. It's like leafy green, the odd koala, and occasionally you might hear some bird noises coming through the window or even a neighbour tootling off to work. But it's a very peaceful place for us to focus.
Yeah, it is. It is beautiful. And look, thank you. Look, this is a exciting time. A new series of podcasts that I really wanted to put out there. And this, for me, is going a bit broader. I think from a medical perspective, look, pathology is the foundation of medicine for a pathologist, of course. But
there are fighting words.
But then we go to the next level. So this pathological life really focused on pathology as the core unit. And I'm wanting to go one step further and say, okay, so we've got medicine now. Pathology is one of the founding pillars, but we can go a little bit further than just a simple test or testing for this. And it's actually, what is the pathology of this disease and different diseases that may not be primary pathology sort of basis. I want to go into areas such as neurology, psychiatry, or anything like that, and I want to pull the stories out and actually bring them to life.
All right. Well, I've got a fresh espresso by my side. I'm ready to start, and we have a fascinating story all about surgery, and I'm just wondering if there's a little bit of jealousy on your part as you look to your medical brethren who are in the surgical stream of medicine.
No, there's actually none. I admire people can do it. I remember being in, you sit in theatre, operating theatres, and look, I remember just watching, and sometimes the procedure that they do is incredible, but not only that, the stress, because, if something goes wrong or something doesn't go in order, you actually have to deal with it there and then and find out what the problem was and then manage it. And so you've got a team of people around, and you've got the surgeon, you've got the anaesthetist keeping the patient alive, the surgeon trying to fix the problem. And look, it's an environment that I found honestly quite stressful. Not only that, you've got 10, 15, 20, 30 patients on the ward that you're still looking after and still responsible for. So it was where I looked at pathology. I thought, actually, I like the the routine of it all. But look, this is for me one of the quintessential moments in surgery. Effectively, the reason why I've called it, Cleft in Twain, and sort of ye old English, is that this is a time, a few hundred years ago, where surgery genuinely became a pre-anaesthetic and a post-anaesthetic. There was a line that clearly demarcated this event. And look, I've just got, two examples. Anaesthetic now is so ubiquitous in medicine. It's almost, to think of medicine without anaesthetic is almost unfathomable. And so this is why this is a, monumental moment. And look, if we just use two examples, one example, is a gentleman by the name of Jan de Doet, who's is a blacksmith, in 1651. Now, he was having trouble with a bladder stone.
Oh, for a moment I thought he was going to be the surgeon.
No. But he was having trouble with bladder stone. And so here's his symptoms. We don't see them, these days. But symptoms of bladder stones is very common in the, ancient times and Middle Ages. And they would have things like abdominal pain and frequency, because effectively you've got this big stone just sitting in your bladder. And they would have, they could have painful urination, so dysuria. They'd even have potentially blood in the urine, incomplete emptying. And so, pretty common. And, even if we look, there are ancient descriptions of surgery to get rid of these bladder stones. And the most famous is known as Cornelius Celsius from ancient Rome, and he wrote down the procedure.
A strong and intelligent person, being seated on a high stool, lays hold of the patient in a supine posture, with his back towards him, and his hips being placed on his knees, with his legs drawn backwards. He orders the patient to seize his own hams with his hands, and to draw them towards his body with all his power, and at the same time he secures them in that position. Then the physician, having carefully pared his nails, introduces his index and middle fingers of the left hand, first the one gently, afterwards the other, into the anus, and places the finger of his right hand lightly on the lower part of the abdomen. First of all, the stone must be sought for about the neck of the bladder, and when it has been brought into that position, a lunated incision must be made through the integuments immediately, over and extending to the neck of the bladder near the anus, with the horns a little inclined towards the ischia. Then a second incision is to be made in the transverse form in the convex part of the wound, so as to open the neck of the bladder. The stone is then extracted by finger or hook.
So, as academic as that sounds,
I'm going to let my coffee go cold.
that is a procedure done fully awake. Now, this operation they called was the apparatus minor or lesser operation, or cutting on the gripe. Most commonly, though, it's actually called cutting for the stone. Effectively, what the people would do is the person would raise their legs up, knees as close to their ears as they could get. The perineum, so the skin between the genitals and the anus, was then cut until they reached the bladder, go into the bladder, and they'd pull out the stone. This was not done by doctors, though. This was done
by blacksmiths.
No, well, this was done by what they called stone cutters. Oh. And so
jewelers.
Even in the whole thing is, even Hippocrates in his writings and his oath for physicians said, "I will not cut for the stone." So this was actually meant for those who were left with the skills to do it. And so, over thousands of years in every culture, there are these stone cutters. And so that brings us back to Jan de Doet in the 1650s. Now, he had already had 2 stones before, and that had been cut out. Oh. And so he wasn't interested in seeing the stone cutters again. So what he ended up doing was he decided he would do it himself.
He'd bang his own anvil.
And so he was going to cut out his own bladder stone. So what did he do? Oh. He sent his wife to the fish market, and he got his brother's help. And so, as Jan tells it, his brother helped him pull his scrotum aside. Then Jan cut his own perineum to the bladder. He did squats to open up the wound large enough for the stone to fit through. Then he reached in with 2 fingers and pulled out the bladder stone, and it popped out.
Do we need all this detail?
Well, here's the thing. This is the remarkable thing about surgery pre-anaesthetic. Here's a person who was not going to go through another operation and was going to do it himself. The desperation that this conjures up is unbelievable. And so what was the size? The size of the stone was about the size of a hen's egg. And it weighed 4 ounces, or around 110 grams. Then he sent his brother to a healer to get the healer to sew up the wound. So the story gets a little bit even weirder.
Oh, great.
In such that Jan ended up getting, it became quite a thing of legend that he had done it. He ended up getting that egg set in gold and to show it to people. And then there is even a painting that you can see of him holding what looks like a hen's egg and the knife he used to cut himself. So...
And they say Instagram is not...
Well, that's an earlier version of Instagram. So this is here, that would be quite the Instagram post these days. But this was the lengths that a person would go to in that time. And look, it's volumes of just desperation.
A Medicare system's not perfect, but by golly, I appreciate it even more.
And the second case I just wanted to touch on, and this was in 1809. Now, this is the story of Jane Todd Crawford. Now, she was a 45-year-old mother of 4 and a devoted Christian. With her husband, they went and saw Dr. Ephraim McDowell because she believed she was long overdue pregnant with twins.
Okay.
Now, she lived in the south of Greensburg in Kentucky in the US. Now, she wasn't pregnant. She actually had a very large ovarian tumor.
Oh, no.
Now, in these times, an ovarian tumor was tantamount to a death sentence. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing you could do. There had not been any successful oophorectomy, so ovarian resection. But she asked if Dr. McDowell could operate. Again, pre-anaesthetic, and he agreed, but he would only do it at his home.
Yes, of course, because that's where you want to do it, isn't it?
Well, it must be where you looked after patients, because that seemed odd to me, I would have thought. But and so Jane agreed, and so at the time came, she rode 60 miles on a horse to Danville. And on Christmas Day of 1809, he conducted a major abdominal operation.
There was nothing much else on his calendar that day.
No, mustn't have been. But the only anaesthetic she had was a dose of opium, which unfortunately doesn't actually dull the pain, but hopefully would help, and several attendants to hold her down. Now, it's important to note the context. We think, oh, okay, you've got your ovary. Remember, this is an experimental procedure. So there was no sterilization. There's a very high risk of bleeding, high risk of infection, and it's extremely painful. The operation took a bit under half an hour, and Jane, during this time, sang hymns and recited psalms. The operation, Dr. McDowell removed an ovarian tumour that was 22 pounds, around 10 kilograms.
A bit bigger than a hen's egg.
Yeah. And remarkably, she survived and recovered. So she was discharged home 4 weeks later and lived another 30 years or so.
Wouldn't it be cheaper if they just gave out hymn books rather than used anaesthetics?
Well, maybe. Maybe it worked. But now, while these are extreme examples, these are the lengths people would go to and endure. Surgery was the last option, and people still chose it sometimes. And this was just unimaginable. And so we are now fortunate in this time, the 1809 with Jane, she was just before, it would have been a few decades, that in the 1800s we're fortunate that a new discovery was on the horizon and that the world was about to be revolutionised with anaesthetic.
Just before we get them going outside for some deep breaths, and I might sing a hymn or two. I've prepared myself now. I'm ready. Dr. Travis Brown for Act 2. And that was a gruesome first act, and I've checked the contract and I didn't put an exclusion in there. So I've got weeks of this ahead of me.
We'll be having the contract negotiations very soon. Look, this takes us into the time where we're fortunate that anaesthetic's starting to come to the forefront. Look, the horrors of surgery are on full display in this time, and you're not even talking about things such as, wars and battles where people are grievously wounded. There's no anaesthetic, and someone's limb needs to come off, or their abdominal cavity has been ruptured. So in a lot of these instances, surgery is the last resort. And look, medical students at the time, they all learnt dissection on dead bodies, but again, there was no anaesthetic. So any patient that needed an operation was awake. Now, there was things that they could use, such as alcohol and opium, but they had many negative side effects, and pain was still an issue. So, ancient Italians, everyone had their technique on how to deal with it. Ancient Italians, they covered a patient's head with a wooden bowl and would beat on it until the patient lost consciousness and then go ahead. So,
I mean, it is like trying to get some help from an Italian waiter in a restaurant sometimes, but that's for crying out loud.
But look, this is what you do. All I can work out is, if I had to look at it, would you? I don't know. I could imagine people getting pass out drunk, but then there's problems with that waking patient up, or even vomiting at that point in time. So, in the late 1700s and 1800s, there was a fad that took the world by storm. It's called mesmerism. This was founded by Franz Mesmer, and his theory. He was out of Europe. He was Austrian. His theory was that gravitational forces of the planets affected human health, and that the human body had this, fluid, this invisible fluid or energy that flowed through it. Initially, he called it animal gravitation, and that he would liken it to the powers of magnetism, that it was invisible, and ended up then changing it to this animal magnetism. And so if this flow through the body was interrupted, or if it was obstructed, that's what caused disease. And so then these practitioners of mesmerism were taught to remove the obstruction and, can return the flow back to equilibrium, and this would heal the patient. Now, this actually took off quite big, and effectively it's the forerunner of hypnosis.
I see. Okay.
So, and this took off in Europe and in the US, and then by the 1840s in the US in New England, they had 20 or 30 lecturers in mesmerism. They had over 200 magnetizers in Boston, and even France, they had Mesmer. So the founder was appointed to the Faculty of Medicine in the Royal Academy of Sciences.
Is this when people started falling asleep during lectures?
Probably not, but at one point in time, Mesmer clearly had used this with surgery and this hypnosis technique, and clearly unsuccessful, unfortunately. So there was an interesting point, though, when I was reading through all of this, is that some people were of the belief that pain was necessary for surgery. And the reason is that pain induces a stress response. So if your body is forced to respond, your body will try and stop the bleeding. So it will protect your life. So if the patient is asleep or unaware, or they're relaxed, the body's not going to respond, and you're much more likely to bleed out.
But also you stress up, you tense up rather. So that surely isn't going to be overly helpful.
Well, that was the theory. So, so not only that, surgery was a spectator sport. And so you have auditoriums packed of people watching what I can only describe as a horror movie of a patient who is not anesthetized being held down, and let's use the most prominent example of an amputation going to happen. And so, yes, you have people who are the medical students and doctors, but you are there to watch a limb being cut off of a patient pretty much fully awake.
So knife flicks.
That's yeah, and so speed is the key. The faster the better, because it will get the pain over and done with, and the operation's done. So 3 minutes in pure agony is different to 5-10 minutes.
Yes.
And so the most famous surgeons of this was Robert Liston, who we will discuss later. But surgery produced some of the most influential figures in medicine. But also this seemed to be a polarizing moment where people either ambitioned and wanted to be a surgeon, or it was such a harrowing experience that it scarred them for the rest of their life. And,
You mean the patients or the actual doctors?
Well, the patients certainly too. There was a case that I'll discuss a little bit later where they clearly are hugely affected by this. And again, if you can imagine, you're a patient going into an auditorium, people are looking down on you, you're conscious, and the patient then would be held down either by assistant or straps, and then the operation would begin. And so it is unimaginable for me. And so there is, horrific scenes talked about where one medical student wrote about seeing a mastectomy performed. That patient was completely awake, and the medical student fled the operation. Now, his name was James Simpson. He ended up becoming a professor of gynecology, but he, after that time, said, I'm not doing medicine, and considered going into law. But fortunately, he didn't. But he ended up going and looking for an anaesthetic, which we'll discuss a bit later. Now, the word anaesthetic is a combination of two Greek words, which is an, which is without, anesthesia, which is sensation. So that's why we get the word anaesthetic. So we come to this time, the 1800s, and the search is on. Now, just mentioning back Professor James Simpson, what did he discover? He found chloroform. So chloroform, he found from, it was created in 1831 by Dr. Samuel Guthrie. He was an American chemist. Now, he was combining chlorinated lime with alcohol, whiskey, to produce a cheap pesticide. And so chloroform ended up being this sweet-smelling, colourless, non-flammable liquid. But what Simpson found was if you put it onto a cloth, and liquid on the cloth, and held it to the face of a patient, they would lose consciousness. It would act as an anaesthetic, and it worked quickly.
Is he the patron saint of serial killers?
Well, there was a whole bunch of old problems with this, something that's very quick acting, that we won't get in, quick acting and loss of consciousness. So there was a whole bunch of problems with that. The other problem was it's really dangerous.
Oh.
And so it was effective, but there's a lot of deaths from people dying of this inhalation of the chloroform. There's even a famous case of a 15-year-old girl who was having an operation, used chloroform, and she died from the chloroform. And so, but the flip side of that is it got a very large boost when Queen Victoria used chloroform for the birth of her 8th child. And so then it's swings and roundabouts. And it was used extensively in the Mexican-American War of 1848 and then in the US Civil War because it was such a fast-acting and effective way to anaesthetize a patient. That brings us to nitrous oxide. And this was discovered in 1772. We will know this as laughing gas.
I was going to say dentists would be pricking their ears up at this point.
So this creates a euphoric state in people. And it initially was used as entertainment. And so, audience could go and they could purchase a balloon filled with nitrous oxide, and then you could watch intoxicated people walking around, acting silly, after they inhaled or snorted the balloon, whichever way they did it.
Please tell me it's safe.
Look, it seems to be safe from the historical perspective in 1844, and dentists are still using it, so it must be safe. But there was a doctor turned exhibitor who's by the name of Gardner Quincy Colton who used this laughing gas, and a dentist. He went to Hartford, Connecticut in the US, and a dentist by the name of Horace Wells tried it. Now, his wife said it made him ridiculous in public. So she wasn't obviously impressed. But he then thought, this has therapeutic options or applications. And so he got an oil silk bag from Colton full of nitrous oxide. He clearly had a tooth that was bothering him. And what he did was he inhaled the nitrous oxide and he got his dentistry partner to pull out the tooth. Afterwards, he said,
"It's the greatest discovery ever made. I didn't feel so much as the prick of a pin."
Now, so what did Wells do? Well, then he learnt how to make nitrous oxide from Colton. And then he sought out a former dentistry partner to introduce him into to people. So he started experimenting, found one of his former students, his name was William Morton, to introduce him to physicians because he clearly got up enough confidence to say, this is something really worth knowing about. And eventually, Wells in 1845 convinced a public example of a dentistry extraction from a medical student. And the medical student received the nitrous oxide, and during the demonstration, the bag was removed early. And as it was being pulled out, the medical student pulled out. Wells, with an auditorium full, was booed and jeers of humbug. And
Wow.
this was seen as a failure. So nitrous oxide had failed. And we'll come back to the combination a little bit of Wells and Morton. But
I hope we do, because at this point I was expecting them to be laughing all the way to the bank.
And so then nitrous oxide, Wells has turned around and said, has been failed and ridiculed in public. And so that brings us then to ether. Now, William Morton, initially he was, a student of Horace Wells at dentistry, is credited with the discovery of ethers. Now, ether was first synthesized in 1540 by Valerius Cordus, named it the sweet oil of vitriol. And this was not used as an anesthetic.
It actually sounds like the name of a Leonard Cohen album.
It could be. And what they ended up using was this was a recreational drug.
Oh.
So the poor British people and American students in the 1800s used it to achieve a high, and they got this feeling of euphoria, and they called it ether frolics. And so that brings us then to the 1840s, and we have the first documented case of ether being used as an anesthetic. Now, this was by Dr. Crawford Williamson Long, who was an American physician and surgeon, and he was out of Jefferson in Georgia. And he observed that students who went on these ether frolics and injured themselves didn't feel any pain. And so he then administered, in 1842, a patient had a tumor on his neck. He administered ether to it and successfully removed that tumor. The problem was he didn't publish that until 1849, 6 or 7 years later. So no one really knows about this remarkable new anesthetic. Which brings us to William Morton. Now, he was studying dentistry in 1840. He was taught by Horace Wells, and they had met up again to introduce for the demonstration, and ended up becoming, I believe, a partner, but it becomes a little bit problematic because of all the legal documents, which is a little bit of a hint. And the experiment is a failure from the nitrous oxide. But regardless, Morton pursues this anesthetic belief, and he ends up finding a Professor Charles A. Jackson from Harvard Medical School, who suggests that instead of nitrous oxide, ether would be a better candidate for this. And so then Morton began experimenting on animals and himself. And in September 1846, they do an experiment on a patient. This is a patient who they thought, let's try and anesthetize them. And the patient awoke and didn't even know the operation had been done.
Oh, wow.
So got success. Now, because he had already seen the public failure, he obviously got up the courage and said, okay, October 1846, a public demonstration using ether. It was at Massachusetts General Hospital. I was with a Dr. John Warren to remove a neck tumor.
Mm-hmm.
And so during the operation, the patient muttered as if semi-conscious, and afterwards said they were in considerable pain, though it had been mitigated. The next day, a second operation was performed, and it was a complete success.
They just upped the dose?
Well, look, remember, they would have had no idea other than just experimenting with, how much to give and how to give it and how to administer it and how to monitor. And so this is completely experimental, getting someone to lose consciousness, and you're not even sure what you're doing.
Yeah.
And so this then, a public demonstration of a successful anesthetized patient, then the news traveled. But the problem was this discovery caused a lot of problems for everyone involved. And so Morton wanted to make a lot of money. And so the problem with ether is it had been known about for centuries. This application was new, but it couldn't be patented. So what ended up happening was he started mixing it with some odor masking products like oil of orange, and then he called it Letheon after the Lethe River of Greek mythology, where drinking the water would erase painful memories, which is quite a nice name when you think about it.
Yes, very creative.
But because he wanted to patent it and make it exclusive for himself, it created a lot of scorn and resentment, because this is an anaesthetic that could be used by everyone, but he was going to make $1 out of it. And so people quickly realized, though, that the smell of this Letheon was ether. And that brings us to the ether controversy, what is actually called the ether controversy. Because if you look at all the people that are there, you have Dr. Crawford Williamson Long, who a few years had done the first operation but just hadn't published it. You've got Horace Wills, who used nitrous oxide and clearly worked alongside William Morton to discover it and present it, had a fail, but then, because of those problems and the failed, ended up dissolving whatever relationship or friendship they had, who went on to discover ether. And eventually, because of that failure, Horace Wells eventually would lose his license to practice dentistry and started experimenting with chloroform, became addicted to it. And one time when he was intoxicated, even threw sulfuric acid at a prostitute, and then went to jail where he committed suicide. And so the problem then for Morton was he continued to claim that he deserved the fame, recognition, and fortune for the discovery of ether for the rest of his life.
I'm glad he was motivated by the common good.
Well, that's the problem. You also have Professor Charles A. Jackson, who helped Morton discover ether. And so this is the problem. So Morton would petition Congress to be recognized as the discoverer, sought financial reward, and they ended up writing like 2 bills for, I think it was $100,000 each, but it never passed Congress. He didn't get any money for it. There was even the example of the French Academy of Medicine, who awarded William Morton and Professor Charles A. Jackson with 5,000 francs for the discovery of ether, which Morton refused, saying he was the only one that should be recognized for it, so he turned it down.
So did all the money go to Jackson?
Well, I'm not quite sure, but, again, this was where he was going. And unfortunately, by the end of his life, Morton had mounting legal expenses, was bitter, ended up coming broke, and died in poverty.
There's not a lot of empathy there, despite that.
So the discovery for the world is remarkable. For the people who discovered it and saw its application, it was a controversial time.
Let's come back in a minute and hear more about the fastest knife in the West. I did say the fastest knife in the West really was the fastest knife in the West End, wasn't it?
That's right. So this is a reference to the UK. So this was the story of Robert Liston, who in 1794, look, he was a pioneering Scottish surgeon. And again, as we mentioned, pre-anaesthetic, fastest was the best. And if you ever look up history and, fastest, this was Robert Liston. So no one was faster than him. Now, he was a giant of a man. He was 6'2", and in those times that was huge. And he was strong, like the people do mention. He held a hand effectively like a tourniquet, which is why, so, when he was doing amputations, he could hold a leg and cut off the blood circulation so that he could cut. And the record for the fastest amputation of a limb is less than 30 seconds. So he could have a limb off within that time. So, and at heart, he was a performer. And for the times, he would be the audience, and his catchphrase before an operation was, "Time me, gentlemen." and then you would go. So he's a larger than life character. You know, he even ended up designing his own surgical knives. There's a list and splint that can be used today for legs. And again, as if the measure is speed, then
He's the P.T. Barnum, really, of the medical world.
he's a remarkable character. But that yes, that speed came with a price. So unfortunately, his resume in some areas is staggering. And yes, he holds the fastest amputation to record. Even to tie off vessels and repair the flap, 2.5 minutes. So you're talking about 30 seconds to take off a limb, about 2.5 minutes to then tie up all the vessels and put the skin flap across. That's remarkable. Less than 5 minutes for an amputation surgery to finish. But there's
how do you practice that? I suppose you do.
Well, he
get gradually
had lots
faster.
of experience. Yeah, super strong person. There was even one story where one of the not of Robert Liston, but one. How you're sawing wood, and one of the biggest fears of surgeons is getting the knife stuck in the bone, and you can't get it out. And there are a story of that happening where the knife got stuck, not for Robert Liston because he was remarkable, but a knife getting stuck in the bone of the leg of a patient. But there's a few stories that are worth mentioning to put Robert in sort of context. And there's an example again coming back to bladder stones. There was a man who had a bladder stone, but just before the operation clearly freaked out, ran away from the operating theatre. Well, Robert then stormed after him. The patient locked himself in a bathroom. He then kicked in the door, grabbed the patient screaming back to the operating theatre where they strapped him in and then operated on him, tied up.
Is that covered by the Hippocratic Oath?
I don't know. I'm trying to work out, these days it's just unimaginable, but there's a story of a young boy who had a skin tag on his neck. That Liston went to the boy's home to remove the skin tag. Well, it wasn't a skin tag; it was a carotid aneurysm, and the boy ended up bleeding out and dying. There's the one that everyone comes to mind is that the operation with the 300% mortality rate. A patient required an amputation, the speed is there. So, Robert stands there and goes, "Time me, gentlemen." Well, the amputation was so quick that with the leg of the patient that he took off, he removed a few fingers of his assistant. He ended up flinging the knife back behind him so quickly that it slashed the coat of a spectator. Well, the spectator died of fright at the scene, probably a cardiac event. And then the patient later died of infection from the wound, and the assistant, whose fingers had been cut off, also died of the infection from the wounds.
It's a little less impressive now.
Well, it is. Another time he accidentally removed a patient's testicle while he was taking off the limb. So look, it's just remarkable to read about. Like the penultimate case that I want to use is that of Henry Pace, and he's a 12-year-old boy. And at the age of 6, he got scarlet fever, and he ended up getting a tubercular swelling of the right knee. His lower leg became withered and contracted, and it was bent at the right angle to the thigh, and it was chronically painful. Now, Robert Liston's management for this was to recommend amputation. Now,
of course it was.
Yeah, and that's right. And, Henry at the time asked, "Will it hurt?" And Robert said, "No more than having a tooth out." And so Henry turned around and said, "Well, then I'll have it done tomorrow." And so the next day comes, Henry's taken to the theatre, he's blindfolded and held down.
That's always a good start to surgery.
And then it took 6 strokes for Robert Liston to cut off the leg. And Henry told the story decades later, and they asked, "Did it hurt?" And he said, "No, but I was billowing all the time."
Oh.
And so clearly it's a traumatic experience that he then would have repressed.
Wow.
And so the unfortunate thing for Henry is this operation was the second last operation before the ether experiment. So, if it had been just a little bit longer, he might have been able to have ether. But when the news of this ether reached the UK, Robert Liston, again, had lived through, mesmerism and everything. And again, nothing had worked except for no anaesthetic. And so he wondered, is this quackery? Is this real or is it not? Now, there was William Squire who acted as the anaesthetist. And so this experiment, again, this demonstration, because everyone heard about what was happening in the US, there was a demonstration set up, and 15 minutes before the operation of this ether experiment, this demonstration, William Squire asked for a volunteer to try the ether to demonstrate it, and no one came forward. And finally, after a little bit of exasperation, Squire ordered the theatre's porter, Sheldrake, to volunteer. Unfortunately, this was not the ideal candidate, apparently. A retired surgeon who was writing at about the time described Sheldrake as fat, plethoric, and a liver no doubt strong to liquor. And so they get him on the table. He takes a few breaths, jumps off the table, screams obscenities, and runs out of the room. And so this then probably puts an end to any further demonstrations. And what ends up happening is Robert Liston comes into the room and he shows the crowd the jar of ether, and he calls it a Yankee Dodge. He said, we're going to demonstrate this today. And the patient's name was Frederick Churchill. Now, he was a 36-year-old. He was a butler, and he'd been suffering from chronic osteomyelitis, so chronic infection of a bone, right knee. And he'd had surgery before, but it had not resolved anything. So it was time for the leg to come off. The patient was positioned. They had two assistants ready, and the ether was administered. And within a few minutes, the patient was ready. He was anaesthetized. Robert Liston did his usual, time me, gentlemen, and within 28 seconds, the leg was off. Patient didn't move. Patient didn't scream. It was a remarkable sight to go from the patient beforehand
Bellowing
yes, at just an inhaled ether, but imagine a few weeks before a cut limb with a patient screaming and being held down, to someone who was alive but seemingly asleep and didn't feel a limb coming off. And so even when the patient awoke, they said, I don't want this operation to happen. And the operation had already happened. The audience laughed. And so Robert stepped away and proclaimed success.
All right. Dr. Travis Brown, I'm so shaken up. I feel like I've just inhaled ether. What an amazing story. This Medical Life is recorded in the Talked About Marketing Studios in Adelaide. For show notes and more information about the podcast, visit thismedicallife.com.au. You can contact the hosts via Twitter. Dr. Travis Brown is at Dr. Travis Brown. That's DR for doctor. And Steve Davis is at Steve Davis. Editing and production is by Tim Whiffen. Design is by Tom Buzenjut. This has been a PathNotes Proprietary Limited production.
Life is uncertain. It's okay to feel stressed, anxious, worried, or frustrated. It's normal. With CalHope's free and secure mental health resources, it's easy to get the help you and your loved ones need when you need it the most. Call our warm line at 833-317-4673 or live chat at calhope.org today.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.